Welcome to Nutrient Cycling. Again, I'm Dr. Stephanie Lansing. So we're going to talk about nutrient cycling, and the first thing to think about when we're talking about nutrient cycling is nutrient availability. So do you have nitrogen fixers that are present? Is there microbial activity that can break down the organic matter to release the nutrients? You can also get nutrients availability through fire, through precipitation, through soil drainage, which depends on soil temperature, soil moisture, the residence time. So if we think about a simple model, you can think about any sort of litter in a soil, in organic soil. And so basically you have energy and nutrients that are in this litter in the soil environment, for example. And then you have a microbial population. Basically that microbes, they're able to break down that organic, the litter that's in that soil. And when they break down, they're basically breaking that carbon bond. And so those dissolved nutrients are released. And then depending on the environment, these microorganisms will release CO2, or in an anaerobic environment, maybe releasing methane. And what they need in order to do this is they need the nutrients in the organic matter for their own growth. And they usually need water or oxygen, or maybe lack of oxygen if they're anaerobes. So if we look at respiration, depending on soil moisture, you can see that again, if it's with oxygen, then you're going to release CO2 versus methane with lots of oxygen. The higher temperature it is, the faster the degradation rate, the faster release the nutrients. For moisture, again, if it's too dry, you don't get enough up until a point where it's saturated, and then it starts seeing decreases because actually anaerobic respiration is less energy intensive and is slower than aerobic. So it actually starts to decrease at one point. And then again, the quality of the material that you're trying to degrade, is it hard to get at? Is it dense? Is it lignin? So all of those affect it. So if we think of what nutrients a requirement for growth, again, taken up in a gaseous form, they're going to have oxygen, CO2 from roots, water, and the rest of their nutrients are going to be taken up from the soil or from the water. So these are going to be your macronutrients in a larger amount. So that's going to be the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It's also going to be kind of the in-between nutrients, our calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then it's our micronutrients, that boron, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, zinc. So these are things they need in a small number. And if it's actually too much, it can actually be toxic to them. And so if we look at nitrogen availability, you can see that usually productivity, so again, the productivity, the respiration rate in an environment is going to increase linearly with inavailability up to a certain point. And then at that certain point, the other nutrients, other resources are going to become limiting. It might be phosphorus, it might be temperature, it might be light, water. So again, we see this kind of linear increase with nitrogen availability to a point. And so if we think about nutrient pools, there's pools where a nutrient resides. And then, so it may be a single organism, a population, a community, a trophic level, in a lake, in the soil. So that's a pool. And then you have the flux, which is the exchange of the rate of exchange. And again, that's going to be a unit material per unit time between these different pools. So when we think about many ecosystems, managed and unmanaged, they're often limited by nitrogen availability. And so you have atmospheric nitrogen, and then you have, again, microorganism nitrogen, soil nitrogen, and plant and animal nitrogen. And there's fluxes between all of these different pools, with, again, the microorganisms sending atmospheric nitrogen back up through denitrification. And then we're actually getting through nitrogen fixers back into the organisms. And so if we look at these pools, we can see that these global nitrogen pool, most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere. Again, way more than any of our other pools. But this is not, this is not biologically available. So reactive nitrogen in the atmosphere, we have trace gases, again, N2O, NOx, ammonia. We have lots in sediments and rocks, but again, a lot of that isn't available. And then we have inorganic nitrogen in the ocean. which is followed by our organic pools and plants and soils. So again, our pools and our fluxes between all these cycles. So we can see again, most of it is here, but we also have quite a bit of pools of organic and then cycling between those. And then you can see the fluxes again, where it's coming. So we have denitrification and biological fixation. And then we have industrial nitrogen fixation, where again, we're bringing more nitrogen in than really is part of the natural cycle through the Haber-Bosch process. And then we have, again, releases of extra fossil fuel nitrogen from biomass burning, from soil biogenic nitrogen release, deposition. We have ocean release. And then in the oceans, we also have that denitrification and fixation cycles and fluxes. And so if we look at kind of over time, the terrestrial nitrogen fixation, what we see is that legume crops, again, are able to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it biologically available. But then we also have now fossil fuels that are contributing to this. And then through this Haber-Bosch process, we're actually taking into from the environment and actually using fossil fuels to put it into an ammonia form where we can use it as a fertilizer. And we can see that the amount of nitrogen that we have in the biological cycle through this nitrogen fertilization process has made us have way more nitrogen in the environment than is really naturally supposed to be available. And so what happens is we get eutrophication. So these chemical fertilizers, for example, are added to plants in the Corn Belt. And then we have runoff of nitrogen that goes down the Mississippi River. And in the Gulf of Mexico, we have a dead zone. And what happens here with eutrophication is basically we have a lot of algal cells that are produced, okay? And as these algal cells die, they basically are decomposed by microorganisms and actually uses up the oxygen in this area. So our mortality is actually caused by lack of oxygen. And all of that is caused by eutrophication of through too much nitrogen in the water, which again creates these algal blooms. And so again, it doesn't have to be nitrogen, it can be phosphorus, but it's one or more limiting growth factor needed for photosynthesis. And when you have this eutrophication, it basically limits light penetration, which depletes dissolved oxygen and organic carbon, decreases visibility, and it adds this extra detritus, which is going to deplete our dissolved oxygen levels during its degradation. And so we can see the consequence of this eutrophication in the Gulf of Mexico, where again, where the Mississippi comes out, we have oxygen levels that are less than 1 milligram per liter. Really, we need to be, way above 5 here. But we're seeing that in certain zones, they're above 5, and then in other zones, they're around 1 to 2 milligrams per liter, which actually creates places where fish can't and aquatic organisms can't live. And again, this is due to nitrogen fertilizer being excess availability. The other thing that we found is not only do we get eutrophication, but we also get species change and losses. So the more nitrogen fertilization that we have, the increase that we get in productivity. So we see that as we add more nitrogen fertilizer, we get more plant growth. But what we also see is that we're increasing dominance and we're decreasing the amount of diversity. So as our plant biomass goes up, your grams per meter squared in a certain area, your species richness is going down. The other thing that we have is we have more nitrogen again inside of our system, biologically available. We're having more trace gases that are releasing nitrogen. So we have that 2 ways. One is through fossil fuel combustion. So again, NO is highly reactive. And when you combust fossil fuels that have nitrogen in, that NO is released, and it can cause smog and tropospheric ozone formation. And we also can get acid rain, where we actually have the N2O and OH actually form and form acid rain, which actually can decrease, again, productivity. We also get N2O, which is a greenhouse gas. It's a potent greenhouse gas. 200 finds more effective than CO2 at trapping gas. It's about 6% of our total greenhouse gases. So again, we have a lot more CO2 in our atmosphere. So even though N2O is much more potent, We just don't have as much of it out there. But again, a lot of that is through denitrification. So what happens is it's incomplete denitrification. So instead of going all the way to N2, it goes to N2O. And again, a lot of that is through nitrogen fertilizer. And then we also have ammonia that's being released through fertilizer, through animals, through manure, so that ammonia can also become an active gas. And so if we look at N2O, which is again through denitrification, incomplete denitrification, we can see that over time our N2O levels were quite low, and they've quite decreased in the last 100 years as we started using more nitrogen-based fertilizer from the Haber-Bosch process. And so again, this when we talk about ammonia, though, we're mainly talking about releasing from animals. And so again, if you have manure and urea, that ammonia can actually volatilize. And so it becomes active, and then it can be actually transported downwind and then deposited into water bodies. So if we look at kind of the overview of the N cycle, we have these pools and fluxes, right? And so if we look at it, we have some that are open and some that are closed. And so we have our dissolved organic nitrogen. That dissolved organic nitrogen can be broken down by microbes, and they can mineralize this ammonia. That ammonia can be used by nitrifiers to nitrite. And then that can be denitrified into gas, or this nitrate can leach into the groundwater. And then again, this dissolved organic nitrogen can also be taken up into our plant and soil biomass. So microbes rule this entire cycle. And again, the pools are small. The available soil pools are small compared to the organic pools where we have this organic nitrogen. And so again, a lot of those microbes are breaking down those organic pools, which allows the available nitrogen to be utilized. So let's go through the inputs. So we have biological fixation, atmospheric nitrogen deposition, and a very small percentage from walk weathering. So again, biological fixation, what is it? It's converting to ammonium, usually in the form of amino acids. Under natural conditions, this is the main fixation pathway that we have. And so who is it done? It's done by bacteria. It's a symbiotic nitrogen fixation relationship between legumes, alder, and this heterotrophic nitrogen fixers, these bacteria, that basically they have these factors here. They're basically here in these legumes. And what they do is they release this nitrogenase, and it's an enzyme that catalyzes the reduction of N2 to ammonia. But it's a high energy. It actually takes triple bonds between the ends for this to happen. And so it requires energy, and it requires phosphorus for APT. So plants supply the carbon, and then the plants receive the nitrogen. It's actually inhibited by very high levels of O2, and it also requires cofactors, molybdate, iron, sulfur. And so since it has all of these requirements, if you have a lot of high nitrogen in the soil, then we're not going to do that fixation. We're going to use the nitrogen that's there. But when we don't have a lot, we're able to use these legumes to fix nitrogen. So the paradox of implementation is that nitrogen is the element that most frequently limits terrestrial plant growth and terrestrial net primary productivity, but it's the most abundant thing in the atmosphere. 72% nitrogen in our air. And nitrogen fixes occur everywhere, but they don't have this competitive advantage until nitrogen becomes limiting, because they need these cofactors, they need phosphorus, and they need this triple bond. And so again, infixtures are seldom light limited. In well-mixed aquatic ecosystems, for example, they can also be nutrient limited from these other things. They may be the ultimate control over N supplies, and also grazing. So nitrogen fixers are often the preferred forage for deer and rabbit and other things, so they eat them up. We can also get inputs from deposition. So it can be wet deposition and precipitation, dry deposition and dust or aerosols, or it can be cloud water and fog, which is important in coastal and mountain areas. And so if we look at this deposition, what's really interesting is you can look at this the exact same day in December of 2002, and we can see here's the deposition of ammonia. So this whole thing is all the ammonia deposition. We can see it being really high of kilograms of ammonia per hectare per year in the Corn Belt. And we can see here that when we look at NOx deposition, NOI deposition, it's really high in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, but it's low in the amounts of ammonia in this area. And so what we can see is it's actually an effect of the fossil fuel use. So not only is it the coal mine area, we're actually extracting coal and releasing this, but it's also where we're driving a lot more cars. You can see here's LA, Florida, where we do our oil and gas, Louisiana here. And this is mainly where our agricultural is, where our corn belt is, where we're adding fertilizer, where we have a lot of animal agriculture. You can see the Eastern Shore here from our chickens. And so again, this is being more tied to, while it's both in deposition that's occurring, that deposition is tied to the source of the nitrogen in the first place that's being deposited. And we have some sedimentary rocks that contain N, but most rocks contain little N, but we can get release from sedimentary rocks. So again, when we look at internal cycling nitrogen, most N is taking it, but plants becomes available through the decomposition of organic matter. So again, over 90% of soil nitrogen is bound in the detritus and it's unavailable. But the microflora can secrete these enzymes, and these enzymes will break down these polymers into water-soluble units, amino acids and nucleotides that then can be absorbed. So again, we already talked about these processes here, these mineralization, mobilization into the biomass, nitrification, and uptake and assimilation. And so let's talk about what controls these. So if we're looking specifically at mineralization, mineralization is closely linked to decomposition. And so if we think about the control of this, it's going to be the soil resources, the climate, so the litter quantity, and the uptake of dissolved organic nitrogen, the quality is going to have how much dissolved organic nitrogen. And again, the microbial carbon to nitrogen ratio is very important because they need this. And then the temperature and H2O are also very important. And this is going to affect the mineralization rate. When we talk about mineralization, it's ammonification. It's taking it from the organically bound to ammonia, NH4, NH4+, where it's available. And so then we have, here's our net mineralization. So your net mineralization is how much ammonia you have. But if you just test for the ammonia, what happens is some of that ammonia is going to very quickly go into nitrite, right? And so our net mineralization is going to be both the ammonia pools plus the nitrite pools. Because again, to get to nitrite, we have to go through ammonia. There's only one way to get there, okay? So those pools together are our net mineralization rates. We have to go from ammonia to nitrite. That's the only way we're going to get our nitrite. So again, we have our ammonia ion. So ammonia is NH3, that's urea manure runoff. And then when it's in its ionic form, it's ammonium, NH4+. And then it goes to nitrite, and nitrite plus DO is going to make nitrate. And again, we don't see fluxes very much of nitrite. It usually goes very quickly to the nitrate. So nitrification. Nitrate is much more mobile than ammonia, so more readily leached from the soil. It is the substrate for denitrification, so we have to go to nitrate to get denitrification. It generates acidity if nitrate's lost from the soil, and it can result in loss of base cations. So again, we have our ammonia plus 2O2 is our nitrate plus 2H plus, again, generates acidity plus water. So it's a two-step process. The first step is nitrosonomus, okay? So nitrosonomus gets us from ammonium to nitrite. And then the second step is conducted by another bacteria called Nitrobacter, and that gets us from nitrite to nitrate. Again, the controls are going to be, we have to have oxygen. The nitrifiers can be slow growing. We have to have nitrifiers to it, nitrosonomus and Nitrobacter, both of them. And we need ammonia. That's our substrate. And so again, based on the ammonia concentration and the oxygen concentration, we need both of these in order to have nitrification occur. And then we also have gas leaks. So again, ammonia has a pK factor of 8.2. So it's going to go from ammonium up to the gaseous form, ammonia, plus H2 at a pK of 8.2. So above that value, we're going to see ammonia released into the environment. Below that value, it's going to stay in its ionic form. And then again, we see those oxides of N, NO, N2O, N2. And so again, N2O, NO and N2O are from autotrophic nitrification, and NO, N2O, and N2 from denitrification. So denitrification is different than nitrification. We don't have a specific bacteria that does it. There's many facultative anaerobes that use nitrate as their terminal electron acceptor in the absence of oxygen. So if there's oxygen, we're not going to do denitrification. It's going to go down in our redox potential, and then we're going to use nitrate. But they're heterotrophic, which means they need carbon as part of this thing. So you have to have a carbon source, you have to have low oxygen, and you have to have nitrate to do denitrification. And during this process, again, we have a dissolved organic nitrogen to ammonium nitrite, which we need oxygen. And then we're going to go to NO2, NO, N2O, and then finally N2. So again, for this denitrification process, if we have incomplete denitrification, we're going to get emissions. So again, we need nitrate, we need carbon, and we don't want oxygen. That's a negative control. So again, where does this denitrification take place? It's very important in wetlands and riparian areas, in less well-drained soils. So again, we have this leaching that can also occur. The most that's going to leach is going to be our nitrate, much more than the ammonia, than dissolved organic nitrogen, and much more than ammonia, because ammonia is going to stick in the soil. And so again, this is kind of where we need to know this entire nitrogen cycle so that we understand where all of our nitrogen goes. So this is the nitrogen ninja card, which we will talk about and know in great detail. But there is one more process that we're going to discuss, and that's called anammox. And anammox is basically where it bypasses that nitrogen cycle that we just went through. And we have ammonium, which combines with nitrite, and goes straight to N2 gas. So it basically bypasses this entire cycle that we have to have. And we get ammonia to nitrite to N2 gas. And again, they derive their energy from this bacteria, these anammox bacteria, from ammonia. And so you need ammonia nitrite to get into and water. And so our classic nitrogen cycle, we go ammonium through this denitrification cycle. We now have kind of all this craziness with the anammox coming through, which basically bypass that cycle. And so the idea is that you can have nitrification to denitrification, which we need oxygen here, and we need COD, or organic content there. But then we also have this anammox process. So we have the Haber-Bosch process creating our fertilizer. That's one way to do it. But in wastewater, we can actually take that ammonia and that nitrite to go to this anammox together. But more, usually we more have nitrification to nitrite, again, nitrification to nitrate, and then denitrification. And then phosphorus, we're only going to talk about for about 2 minutes, because with phosphorus, the organisms excrete phosphorus. It's in their organic pool. We actually have a large amount of inorganic phosphorus through rocks, that sediment. And then it leaches once we take it out of the organic, it goes into phosphate, and that's it. It doesn't have or aerosol form. It goes organic, inorganic, organic, inorganic, okay? So we have phosphates in rocks, we have phosphates in detritus and animals and manure, and then we have phosphates when it's in its liquid form, and that's all it does. And thank you very much.